Okay, so think about this for a second, right? We look at our faces in the mirror every day. It's like this familiar landscape, right? But have you ever stopped to really consider how that landscape actually came to be? Like, how did our faces evolve to look the way they do, especially when we compare them to our ancient relatives?
That's exactly what we're diving into today. We're looking at some groundbreaking research that compares the mid-facial growth of us, modern humans, to Neanderthals, and even to chimpanzees.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that article you sent me is fascinating. It really takes this multifaceted approach, right? It looks at both the macroscopic form and dives into the microscopic bone structure to really get at the heart of those developmental pathways that have resulted in these very different faces.
Absolutely. And our mission for you, our amazing listeners, is to really break down those key developmental steps that led to, well, us, our smaller, more tucked in faces compared to those larger forward projecting faces that we see in Neanderthals. And I'm telling you, there are some truly surprising findings in this research about how our faces actually grow. But okay, let's back up a bit. When we put a human skull next to a Neanderthal skull, what are those most immediate differences? What jumps out at you?
Well, the first thing you notice, right, is the difference in the midface. I mean, the adult human midface is relatively small and retracted. It kind of sits back under the skull.
Oh,
And we have this unique feature, the canine fossa, which is that little dip right above the canine tooth.
right, right.
Now, Neanderthals, totally different story. Their midfaces, much more prominent. They project forward significantly. And that's what we call midfacial prognathism. Their upper jawbone, the maxilla, is also more inflated. They have this wide, prominent nasal aperture that's the nose opening. And that canine fossa that we have, nope, they don't have it.
So essentially, their faces are almost the opposite of ours, right? Bigger and sticking out. And I've heard terms like robust and gracile thrown around in this context. Do those terms apply here?
Oh, absolutely. Robust. That's often used to describe the heavier, more powerfully built features we often see in Neanderthals and other earlier hominins. And it definitely fits when we're talking about their faces and those prominent brow ridges above their eyes. Our facial structure, on the other hand, is more delicate, smaller, less pronounced. So we often use the term gracile to describe it.
Okay, so we see these stark contrasts in the adult faces. But this research really gets into the nitty-gritty of how those differences develop. So tell us a little bit about how they actually compared the growth process over time.
So they use this really cool technique called geometric morphometrics. Basically, imagine creating a digital blueprint of the maxilla bone and then placing these very precise landmarks on it. The researchers did this for a large sample of humans, Neanderthals and chimpanzees, spanning from newborns all the way up to adults. And by meticulously tracking how the positions of these landmarks changed with age, they could quantify the size and shape of the midface at different stages of development. They categorized these stages based on dental development, things like the emergence of baby teeth and the eruption of those permanent molars.
So it's like creating a time-lapse video of facial growth and then comparing those videos across the three species.
Exactly. That's a fantastic analogy. And what this large-scale comparison revealed was pretty striking. They found that even at birth, the average human midface is already smaller than the average Neanderthal midface. And then, after birth, our midfaces grow at a slower rate compared to Neanderthals.
So essentially, we start smaller and never really catch up in terms of size as we develop.
Not only do we not catch up, but the research also highlights this growth pattern that appears to be unique to humans. It's the early cessation of growth around adolescence. We just stop growing. Our midfaces plateau, and this wasn't observed in Neanderthals or chimpanzees.
Wow, so while our faces are pretty much done growing by our teenage years, theirs kept going. That's a huge difference.
It is. Neanderthal and chimpanzee midfacial size continues to increase in those later postnatal periods. It's kind of like the period between when humans are getting their first and last adult molars, right? And by the time they reach adulthood, Neanderthals have even larger midfacial dimensions than chimpanzees.
That's a pretty dramatic divergence in growth patterns. Now, the paper talks about these different age groups or ages. Could you explain those for our listeners just so we're all on the same page?
Sure thing. So AG1, that represents neonates, the newborns. AG2 is the stage where the deciduous teeth, those are the baby teeth, are actively developing and erupting. AG3 is marked by the complete eruption of the first permanent molar. AG4 is when the second permanent molar has erupted. And finally, AG5, that's when the third permanent molar, the wisdom teeth, have fully erupted, which they used as an indicator of adulthood. So these dental milestones provide a common framework to compare development across the species.
Okay, I see. So we humans, we hit the brakes on mid-facial growth much earlier. Now, the researchers also did some really interesting developmental simulations. Can you talk a little bit about those and what they tell us about the underlying growth patterns?
Oh, these simulations were really clever. What they did was take the pattern of facial growth from one species and apply it to the newborns of another. So, for example, they simulated chimpanzee newborns growing according to a Neanderthal growth trajectory. And the simulated adults ended up looking like typical adult chimpanzees. But when they simulated those same chimpanzee newborns growing according to a human growth pattern, they ended up resembling younger chimpanzees. It was pretty remarkable, actually.
Wait, so our growth pattern actually kind of holds back the development of the midface compared to what a chimp would look like if it grew like a Neanderthal.
Exactly. And they ran the simulations in the other direction, too. They simulated Neanderthal newborns growing along a chimpanzee trajectory. And you know what? They ended up looking quite similar to adult Neanderthals. But when those same Neanderthal newborns were simulated to grow along a human growth pattern, they looked more like younger humans.
So it's not just a question of starting size, it's the way we grow that makes us different.
It really is. And here's the kicker. When they simulated human newborns growing according to either a Neanderthal or a chimpanzee growth pattern, the simulated adults ended up with more forward-projecting midfaces, looking a lot like Neanderthals.
Okay, now this is where things get really fascinating for me. It's not just the size at birth, it's the specific way our faces grow that really makes the difference.
Hmm.
So did they also look at shape changes in the midface as it develops? Did they find any differences in how the shape changed in humans versus Neanderthals and chimps?
Absolutely. They used that geometric morphometric data to analyze the shapes. And they found that while the overall rate of shape change during development seems to be relatively consistent across the three species, the actual developmental trajectories, the paths that humans and Neanderthals follow, they're distinct from birth. They start with slightly different shapes and develop along different lines.
What were some of the key shape differences that jumped out at them?
Well, the first thing they looked at was what's called the first principal component. It basically captured the largest amount of variation in shape, and it mainly reflected differences in the overall height of the midface bones. Older individuals, regardless of species, tended to have longer faces. But the real star of the show was the second principal component. That's what really helped distinguish Neanderthals from humans. They found that Neanderthals tend to have this shorter but larger frontal process of the maxilla. That's the part that goes up towards the forehead. And humans, we have more elongated and thinner frontal process.
I see. And were there any shape features that were noticeably different right from the start in newborns?
Yeah, even at birth, Neanderthals already showed this more forward-projected nasal region compared to human newborns. But you know that characteristic inflation of the infraorbital region, that puffed-out cheekbone area that we associate with Neanderthals, well, it wasn't as prominent at birth. It seems like it develops more significantly during those first few years of life and becomes more pronounced as they grow.
So they don't start with a dramatically different shape. It really takes hold after birth.
Right. And they also dug down to the microscopic level, actually looking at bone remodeling.
And how did they go about investigating that? Because that sounds incredibly complex.
It was. They use a technique called surface histology. Basically, they made replicas of the maxillary surfaces, and whenever possible, they used high-resolution microscopy to examine those replicas. They were looking for microscopic signs of bone formation and resorption, the cellular processes that constantly reshape our bones throughout our lives. It's what we call bone modeling.
So what did this microscopic analysis reveal about how Neanderthal facial bones were developing compared to ours and chimpanzees? Were they like building bone in different places or at different rates?
Okay, so one interesting thing they found early on was that both Neanderthal and human newborns showed bone resorption around the developing canine tooth bud. That's different from chimpanzees, where the main area of resorption at that stage was in the premaxilla, which is the front part of the upper jaw.
Okay, so a shared pattern in humans and Neanderthals in that specific area. What about later in development?
Well, that's where a key difference emerged. They found that overall, Neanderthals show less bone resorption compared to humans. And even more significantly, they saw this extensive bone formation in the Neanderthal nasal region. It seems that active buildup of bone played a major role in creating that forward-projecting nasal area and contributed to that overall midfacial prognathism.
Wow. So while we might be getting our shape partially through a process of breaking down bone in certain areas, they were building it up, especially in the midface.
Exactly. And while Neanderthals did have some bone resorption in the lower part of the maxilla and the zygomatic process, kind of like we see in humans and chimpanzees, the dominant activity in their upper maxilla, especially around the nose, was bone formation.
I imagine it must be incredibly challenging to get a complete picture of this from fossils, right?
It really is.
Yeah.
The preservation of these tiny microscopic features in fossils is, well, it's tricky. So it's tough to get a complete picture of bone modeling across all areas of the Neanderthal face at every stage of development. But they were able to estimate the total amount of bone resorption in two Neanderthal individuals who were relatively well preserved, and their estimates fell within the lower range of what we typically see in humans.
Interesting. So less overall bone breakdown in Neanderthals. And what about the patterns of bone resorption? How did those change with age in the different species?
All three species showed an increase in bone resorption between the newborn stage and the next age group. But then in humans, this was followed by a gradual decrease in bone resorption throughout childhood and adolescence. And that trend wasn't as clear in chimpanzees. They seemed to maintain a more consistent level. Statistically, they found a significant difference in the overall percentage of bone resorption between humans and chimpanzees.
Okay, so let's zoom out a little bit. What are the main conclusions from both the shape analysis and the bone remodeling data? What are the key takeaways about how our faces evolved differently from Neanderthals?
Well, I think this research really highlights that both early and later phases of development after birth are crucial in shaping the distinct facial features we see in these species. The fact that humans stop growing so early, it seems to be a major factor in the gracilization of our midface, giving us those smaller, more retracted faces. And the higher levels of bone resorption during childhood in humans, that probably contributes to this retraction and the compact size of our upper jaw.
Right, so it's this combination of growing less overall and remodeling more through bone resorption that gives us our unique facial appearance. And that's in direct contrast to Neanderthals, who had more prolonged growth and more bone formation, particularly in that prominent nasal and midfacial region, leading to that prognathism.
Exactly. And when we consider the bigger picture of human evolution, it's fascinating to think that early Homo sapiens, they actually had larger faces than we see in modern humans. This suggests that the reduction in facial size was a gradual process that occurred later during the late Pleistocene.
Wow. Early members of our own species had more robust faces than us. Fascinating.
It is. And they also pointed out that the patterns of bone modeling within the human maxilla are pretty consistent across different human populations today.
And what does that tell us?
Well, that consistency suggests a strong genetic influence on how our facial shape develops. The subtle differences we see between different human groups are likely the result of small variations in the timing and rate of those cellular activities, bone formation and resorption, all guided by our genes.
So to wrap up this deep dive, what are the absolute must-remember points for our listeners? What are the key insights they should take away about how our faces evolved differently from Neanderthals?
Well, the main points are these. Humans have this unique pattern of early cessation, of significant midfacial growth. Neanderthals and chimpanzees, they don't have that. And we also have those higher levels of bone resorption during childhood, which contributes to our smaller, more retracted upper jaw. And in contrast, Neanderthal facial development was characterized by more continuous growth and more bone formation, especially in that prominent nasal and midfacial region, leading to that prognathism.
And for me, the biggest takeaway is that our smaller faces aren't just a simple anatomical difference, right? They're the result of these fundamentally different developmental pathways, particularly during late childhood and adolescence. It's not just that we ended up with smaller faces, it's how we grew into them that's so distinct.
I agree.
So here's something to think about. If these significant facial differences between us and Neanderthals arose from specific changes in developmental timing and bone remodeling, what other seemingly small changes in our developmental programs might have led to the incredible diversity we see in humans today? Or even to the unique traits of other hominin species that are no longer with us? It really makes you think about the power of those tiny changes in growth and development over vast stretches of evolutionary time. And as always, we hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on this incredible aspect of our evolutionary journey.
Thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure.